Jewish Insights with Justin Pines on JBS is made possible in part by the clubs at Pearl River, New York, luxury rental communities for ages 55 and better, now leasing Phase 3 at the Reserve, and the B.L. Manger Foundation.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. In this episode, I have the privilege of speaking with Rabbi Herzl Hefter, a leading teacher of Torah whose work bridges intellectual rigor, spiritual depth, and personal authenticity. Rabbi Hefter is the founder and dean of Beit Midrash Har'el in memory of Belda Kaufman Lindenbaum in Jerusalem, a place where advanced Torah learning is integrated with a serious commitment to spiritual development. He's known for guiding his students through some of the most profound and complex currents in Jewish thought, and few are more fascinating than the teachings of the Ishbitzer Rebbe. The Ishbitzer, Rabbi Mordechai Yosef Leiner, was a 19th century Hasidic master whose writings, especially in his work Mei HaShiloach, offer a radically intimate, often considered controversial, which we'll discuss, view of divine providence, human will, and the soul's path. We'll explore what the Ishbitzer can teach us about our inner life, our moral complexity, and the spiritual courage it takes to truly know oneself in relationship with God. And before we start, I want to just thank my cousin, Mindy Feldman-Hecht, who made the shidduch here. Mindy let me know that Rabbi Hefter would be in town and reacquainted us, and I'm so thrilled you're here today. Thank you, Rabbi Hefter.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here.
All right, so I want to get to the Ishbitzer, but before we get to the Ishbitzer, I want to hear how you got to the Ishbitzer. So tell me a little bit about your journey. I know you didn't start off learning Chassidut, and how you ended up there. Share with us.
A number of different paths converged. I began with actually the high school that I studied in Brooklyn, Yeshiva Flatbush, was very open institution, and I went from there to Yeshivat Har'el, where my background in Talmud started off as a little weak. Most of the students there came from institutions, from high schools where Talmud study was more intense, but the background was a little more narrow. So I got into this Talmud study pretty fast, but I felt there was something, like I had a certain sort of horizon that the people around me, they had different horizons, and there was always this dissonance that I had, a slight dissonance. I was very much into the institution, and as time went by, I studied in Yeshivat Har'el for 10 years.
Wow.
And 2 years, then another 8. I went to Yeshiva University in the meantime. There was always something I felt lacking, but I didn't know exactly what it was. I couldn't put my finger on it. And then at some point, when I used to come back to visit my parents here in New York, I used to wander around Barnes & Noble, and I found this book about comparative religion by Mircea Eliade, who's one of the founders of comparative religion in the United States. And that opened up a world for me, that all the things that I thought were uniquely Jewish, it turned out that other cultures and civilizations also had analogous stories or analogous rituals with similar explanations. That opened up a world for me. And I remember I showed it to a chavruta of mine, to a partner who I learned with, and very sharp guy. And he looked at it and he said, "Oh, it's kfirah. It's, apostasy."
Okay.
So, he said it lightly, but anyway. So there was always something else. Now, I have a family connection to Ishbitz because my mother's family were Radzina Hasidim, which is the Hasidut that came out of Ishbitz. And my wife was also independently into that. So as I grew a little bit older, so I started studying Hasidut in general, and particularly Ishbitz. So it's a combination. Where I am now is sort of a combination of you could say, the Talmudic rigor and rationalistic approach that I got at Yeshivat Har'el. But sitting on top of that is a Torah of the heart, which Ishbitzer very much talks to. So that's where I am right now.
Beautiful. Let me ask a couple follow-ups there. I know you spent 10 years, which was amazing. I spent 1 year at Yeshivat Har-Etzion, and it was very powerful for me, also known as the Gush in Israel. I know that you received smicha from Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, who we just came up on 10 years since he passed. I was there, I think, his second to last year. Just on one foot, a highlight, something that you take from him that he influenced you in the way that you are in the world.
He was very hard on himself. Bit of a Puritan, very much searching for his authenticity. And he, of course, found it in in-depth study of Talmud, and always connected with rigorous ethical behavior. I remember at his 80th birthday party, where they were honoring him, and they didn't talk about all his lamdanut, about how in-depth his learning was, but they talked about how honest he was. And I actually pointed that out to Tova Lichtenstein, his wife. I pointed that out to her. I said, it's interesting that they're talking about his yirat shamayim, about his fear of heaven and his righteousness. And that's how it should be. Because if the Torah doesn't bring us to righteousness, then we don't need it.
Beautiful, great. And then give me a sentence on what you're doing at Har'el, so people who can come visit in Yerushalayim.
So I used to rant and rave around the house about certain, I would say, injustices that I found in Orthodox society, being very much identified with it, which is why it bothered me so much. And my wife said, it's not so healthy for you, you have to do something. So the opportunity arose where someone asked me to teach them Yoredeya, to teach them to prefer smicha, to mentor them. And I said, look, I have 6 kids, I can't mentor one person to be a rabbi, but if you get a group of people together, I'll consider it. And he asked, almost out of hand, men and women. So I said, yeah. So that's how it started, sort of a grassroots Beit Midrash, and it developed from once-a-week program to a full-time program, where men and women study to get smicha together in a Beit Midrash environment. It's Orthodox smicha, and I signed the smicha together with Rabbi Professor Daniel Sperber, and that's what we do in the Beit Midrash. That's the Beit Midrash program, and I also convened a think tank of, you could say, Jewish luminaries, Tamar Ross, David Bigman, Daniel Sperber, Vered Noam, and others, to try to encounter the challenges that Orthodoxy faces today in a way which doesn't go to mediocre apologetics, but really tries to grapple with the core issues, which I think go around theology of halacha, what it is we do when we interpret, what influences our interpretations, and that, I hope, will lead to a more open approach within tradition, totally committed to tradition, but becoming more self-conscious about what we're doing. And once you're more self-conscious about what you're doing, it gives you more flexibility.
Just give an example for someone not familiar with comparative religion.
Okay, let's say, I'm just thinking of an example. Say we have the mitzvah of mezuzah, right? Mezuzah, right? It sort of accentuates the sanctity of the threshold.
Right, with the mezuzah we put on the side.
We put it on the entrance to our home, and then I found that there's a whole mythology, a cross-cultural mythology about the sanctity of the threshold, right? And different ways of commemorating that, right? And that struck me as, oh wow, they have, that idea also. They could have different rituals. Like you can even think about it if anybody's studied martial arts. When you enter the dojo, right, you go like that. Yeah. So that's also a sort of a mezuzah, right? When you enter, you delineate the space, right? So that's what the mezuzah is, that you delineate the space, of course, with Shema Yisrael, right? So that becomes the temple in a sense.
Beautiful. So take it one step further for me. I know that we're just jumping into comparative religion, but Okay, so you have a sense of what Judaism has to say about the mezuzah. You've alluded to the idea of there's something holy about entering into a new threshold. In particular, a home is a place of sanctity. So we have on our wall, we kiss and remind ourselves, our core, line, like, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, Shema Yisrael, and then we go into the space, and then you discover that it turns out that other cultures have similar practices, I assume either predate or coincide with
Right,
Judaism.
but they could have no knowledge of each other.
Could have no knowledge of each other. Great.
No.
So what do you do with it? Now you've
that's
encountered
really
that
good.
information, what do you do with it?
Right, so for a long time, things like, this was just one example, but there are many examples.
Let's just play with this one.
But for a long time, it actually bothered me because I came from a place where the Torah is unique. Mm-hmm. And it's a product of divine revelation, so nothing else can be like it. Mm-hmm. And to find rituals which symbolize similar or analogous ideas it really bothered me. Mm-hmm. And it sort of sat on my heart for a while, until I realized that I modified my view of revelation, and this is based on actually on Hasidic teachings, where the idea is that God is always broadcasting, and a person experiences revelation when they fine-tune themselves to God's broadcasting. It's sort of a naturalistic view of revelation, of prophecy. It's the approach of the Maimonides, but it's also the approach of Chassidut in general. So if God is always broadcasting, and revelation is sort of a natural phenomena built into the way God created the world, so then it should actually be natural that you should find similar stories, similar rituals that address similar human concerns, because we're all human. And we're all interpreting our environment and trying to give it meaning. So if I find similar rituals, it actually it went from becoming a challenge to my faith to actually reinforcing my faith. Right? It has to do with sort of like a Copernican revolution, right? They used to think the Earth was in the middle, right? So then they discovered the Earth is not in the middle. So I think like this is part of a discovery for me. It's like a Jewish Copernican revolution. We have a tendency to think that we're in the middle. We're not in the middle. We're part of creation, and we have to find ourselves there. Right, so that makes the whole story actually much bigger.
Beautiful. I'll play with that a little bit also. The way I like to think about that sometimes is, even if we're just working within the big three religions, let's say the three Western religions, almost think of it as like three children in the same house, right? So the parents have hopefully shared the messages with each of the kids, but they have different personalities and different ages, and they've come along at different times. So, it's, yes, the parents uniquely told me whatever message they told me, but they also told my sibling that message as well, and that we might have heard it differently or heard it in a way that made sense to us, but it's coming from the same parents in some way.
Right. I would add, first of all, I've done some work on Eastern religions, so I wouldn't just say that about the Western historical religions, but yes, but I would also add to what you're saying that what each child got is not only a function of what the parent told them according to what was appropriate to them at that time in their lives, but according to who they themselves are, because the parent could say a lot of things, or let's translate it into the world. There's a lot of data, right? And the question is not only how we interpret the data, but what pieces of data we actually perceive, and that depends on who we are. So there's the question is, where does it begin? And that's also something connected to the Mei HaShiloach, and Hasidic teaching in general, that there's a certain naivete, that there's a world out there and we perceive it. The world out there is a function of who we are.
Take that a step further. What is personal revelation? Like, is that something you actively choose to do, or it happens? What's personal revelation?
Well, first I want to make sure that it doesn't sound pretentious.
Okay.
Right? God spoke to me.
Yeah.
Right? How do you know? God spoke to me. So of course we're taught, and I think correctly so, that people have to be refined, and just because you think God spoke to you, it doesn't mean that God spoke to you. But I think all revelation. Okay, I'll actually bring this in by something the Mei HaShiloach said.
Beautiful.
Okay, Mei HaShiloach talks about Abraham's journey, right? lech lecha, right? And
go from your home.
Right, depart from your home. And there's a Midrash that talks about Avram's journey, and he looks around, and the sun, the moon, and then he finally comes to a house which is burning. And he says, "Where is the master of the house?" And God appears upon him. "I am the master of the house," right? So the Mei HaShiloach says that the house that's burning, we could think, Abraham witnessed the downfall of civilization in the story of the great Tower of Babel, right? So Avram sees the world burning around him, and he's asking, like, what's the meaning of this? Like, that's such a Jewish thing. Like, what's the meaning? So, and God's answer to him when he says, "I am the master of the house," is that you're looking in the wrong place. The burning is, you're the only one that asked the question. How come nobody else asked the question? That means there's something about you, right, that is stirring in your heart. And I am the one that is stirring your heart. Lech lecha, literally go get thee out, right? But he sort of plays a sort of a Hasidic midrash. Lech lecha, lech el atzmecha. Go to yourself. And that's where you'll find the answer. And ani bal habira, I am the master of the palace. The I, the Mei HaShiloach says, is a double entendre. I is also Avram saying, "I am." So Avram understands that it's God inside of him. So that's the divine revelation, let's say the stage upon which divine revelation occurs can only be human consciousness. It can be nothing else.
Why? Sorry.
Why? Because we can only perceive what's inside ourselves.
Right.
There's this idea, it's in the Tanya, and it's also David Hume. David Hume called it the copy principle.
Okay.
And the Tanya and Sha'ar Yichud Amuna also talks about it, that we can only...
Just say what the Tanya is.
Oh, the Tanya, Rosh Shnei Zalman Miladi, the founder of Lubavitch Chassidut, of Chabad. He lived in the 18th century. He was a disciple of the Maggid, contemporary of the Gra, of Rabbi Lezer from Vilna. There's a lot to say, right? We're not going to go into that, right? But you can Google the Tanya, you'll find a lot.
Yeah.
So the idea is that you can only perceive, let's say, the wisdom of God if you have wisdom. You can only perceive the love of God if you have love in your heart. Because we can only perceive ultimately what's inside ourselves, and we can project that to the outside world. But if a person, let's say, has no love, they can't perceive it in the world. Right? That's what a sociopath is, right? They don't see it, right? So, the only reason we can perceive anything of God is because we're created in the image of God. So we have God inside ourselves, so we can recognize those things. But it can only happen within human consciousness. As the truth is, this is already getting into different philosophical schools, but everything that happens, right, is through our interpretation. It starts with what's happening with us. And particularly in theology, it's because it's the God inside of you that makes that meaningful.
Beautiful. All right, I want to zoom out in a second, but I'm gonna go one step further out of curiosity.
Into the rabbit hole.
Yeah, into the rabbit hole. So I remember being a kid and recognizing that different realities exist for different people, and that whole experience.
Yeah.
And I remember, and this I guess is a philosophy question, but I'll ask it anyway, which is like, what are the limits of that? How far that goes? The example, I know we talked about baseball was an area you had a little bit of sports, but like, could it be in my reality, the Yankees won last night, and in your reality, the Mets won last night? Like, how far does our disparate reality... There are obviously certain subjective things that are very obvious that you can look at differently, but like certain things, for me, that was the thing that was like the most objective. We know who won the game last night. How could we disagree about that? But to what extent, how different can our realities be, because we're each living in our own consciousness?
The question is, what meaning do I ascribe to it? Let's say there are certain things that can happen in your personal life or certain things that happen in history. And at the time, the impression you had was this is a really good thing, or that it was a really bad thing. And then in hindsight, you understand it totally differently.
Right.
So there's a new interpretation. So does that change history? No, history is what you interpret it to be. It's what you take notice of. Right.
Got it. So we had Rabbi Zev Reichman talking about Rabbi Nachman, finding good points in everything and finding joy in everything. That'd be an example of that, where it's like, yes, the Yankees lost, but actually it's a good thing the Yankees lost, even if you're a Yankees
fan. But that's right, because then they reshuffled the team and they went on to win 10 World Series in a row. Exactly. So it seemed like a tragedy then.
Beautiful.
But it was
beautiful. All right, fine. So we jumped in, which I'm enjoying very much, but I want to zoom out for 1 second and just kind of say, who was the Ishbitzer, and how did he differ? Maybe you could place him in Hasidic thought in general. Like, I know we're not going to do a whole speech what's Hasidut, but a little bit like why he stands out in that space, and also what draws you to him. And you mentioned there's a familial connection.
Yeah.
And maybe that's enough. But.
No, I mean, what drew me to him is, all right, I'll tell you first who the Ishbitzer was. He was a Hasidic master in the beginning of the 19th century, a part of what you could call the Polish Revolution of Hasidut, where Hasidut really began with the Baal Shem Tov outside of Poland, and it was a sort of very folklorish movement, and it became much more rigorous when it came to Poland, particularly in the third generation of the Yehudi HaKadosh from Pshischa, known as the Yid HaKudosh, right? And he had a disciple, Reb Simcha Bunim of Pshischa, who was a very interesting character. We're talking like the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. He had a secular education, Reb Simcha Bunim. He didn't wear shtreimel. He knew Latin. He actually was a pharmacist by trade, so he was pretty open to the world, right? And around him, there was they collected a group of Hasidim, which became the Polish Hasidut. The Mei HaShiloach, the Kotzker, was in that group. The first Ger Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Meir of Gur, was in that group. So it was a very intense group, and that was like a revolution in Polish Hasidut, where people returned to the study of Talmud. In Hasidut, it became much more rigorous. And of course, when he died, the Kotzker took over, right? The Kotzker was known to be a rather severe personality, and very intense. Right? Herzel wrote about Kotzker and Kierkegaard and the passion for truth. And the Mei HaShiloach was sort of a disciple of the Kotzker, but also a comrade. Kotzker was a little bit older, and then there was a very acrimonious break, which nobody knows anything. Nobody knows what it was about. Eli Wiesel in Souls on Fire, I think he writes about it. It's like a mythological break in Polish Hasidut.
Sure.
And I think there are other academics who wrote about it, what it might have been about. I think it was about that. I think that the Mei HaShiloach thought that the Kotzker was much too severe. The Mei HaShiloach had a much kinder disposition. So I think it was more or less around that. There are teachings in the Mei HaShiloach which allude to such things. He talks about Yosef. He talks about Yosef as the tzaddik, as the righteous one who is very intolerant. Right? Because that's the story that Yosef always told. Lashon Hara, spoke against his brothers, so that he said there's a certain intolerance that a righteous person has because they don't have empathy for the weakness of others. So, and he writes about that as like a lack of faith that the righteous person has. It's very interesting to write about that way. And I think he was sort of referring to the Kotzker.
Got it. Wow.
That's my theory.
Beautiful. All right, and then let me, I'll just, first of all, for those, keeping up at home, he's called the Ishbitzer because he's from
the town of Ishbitz.
And he's also called the Mei HaShiloach because the name of his book.
Right, the name of his book is the Mei HaShiloach.
Beautiful.
Because Reb Simcha Bunim said of him that his waters run deep like the Mei HaShiloach. And that's when they came to name the book, they used that.
Beautiful. Okay, great. And then why, I use the word radical in the green room. You told me slow down a little bit.
Right.
Why is he seen as this person that kind of stands out as, like, I learned Hasidut, but not Mei HaShiloach. Like, there seems to be this vibe that he's like.
He definitely stands out, but he he has this saying that sort of became a mantra for people that study him, Hakol bidei shamayim afilu yirat shamayim. Everything is in the hands of heaven, even the fear of heaven. Now, that is sort of a corruption of the Talmudic statement that everything is in the hands of heaven except the fear of heaven, which of course means that there's freedom of choice, right? And the Mei HaShiloach seems to deny free will, right? So my master's thesis, right, shows that that's not so. That he's not talking about an exterior reality of whether God, the medieval question of divine knowledge and free will. That's not what interested the Mei HaShiloach. What Mei HaShiloach was talking about is certain layers of consciousness where a person can be in a relationship with God where they feel they have no free will, that they feel the presence of God everywhere. And that it's not a statement about the outside world. It's a statement about a person's religious experience. There's reason, now's not the place to bring quotes from all the pieces, sure. But I think that's what he means. He's talking about there are different layers of consciousness in which we operate in the world. There's one layer of consciousness where we have free will and we have responsibility for what we do, right? And he says that also. But we also sometimes are in a certain state of mind where we feel we don't have free will, and that's also a reality. But it's an eternal reality. He's not interested in the external reality the way they were in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, they thought they were talking about the world. After Descartes realized, I think, therefore I am, right, that we're not talking about the world, we're trying to figure out how we know anything at all, and it all begins with what's inside of us. And then there's a question of whether it's our intellect, I think, therefore I am, or maybe I feel, therefore I am. That wouldn't be Descartes. That would be more like Nietzsche, right? So, but from the time Descartes said, like, how do I know anything? All of a sudden the spotlight, in a sense, turned inward, right? And Chassidut is part of that sort of modern, in that sense, Chassidut is a modern movement.
Got it, okay. I'm keeping up here. Hopefully our audience is as well. I think it's so zooming out for 1 second, I don't want to go too deep into this one, but
You wanted to go down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, totally. I take that one I think about that a lot. Like everything is in God's hands except for your relationship with God, basically. To me, I think of as like, I have the ability to choose to be aware of God. You talked about kind of like interpreting things backwards before, right? If you start to see God's hand in everything, then you realize God's hand is in everything, and then you can put in all the effort you want, but if it didn't work out, it didn't work out, and if it did work out, it did work out, that kind of thing. And then he's saying, even whether or not you choose, others would say about him, even whether or not you choose to believe in God is actually in God's hands, that thing itself. And you're saying, no, that's not actually what he's saying.
That's not what he means.
He's saying it's something about if you get to a certain level of, let's call it, you said consciousness, maybe it's like your relationship with God, whatever it is, that you get to a level where it feels like you're not making a choice anymore. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that a person can feel compelled to do something, right? And you actually feel that you don't have a choice. I think that's where Paro was, by the way. That was the compulsion of Paro.
What happened to
Paro's,
him?
Yeah, Paro's loss of free will is that he just felt he didn't have a choice.
Right. And I've seen interpretations there as well that like once Paro, I never know how to say it in English. Paro, is that right? Paro?
Pharaoh.
Once Paro or Pharaoh, once he went deeper and deeper into resisting, that like eventually he became so far over there was no coming back.
Right. So it's sort of like an obsession.
Okay. And so, I mean, if I had to try to, if we're married to God, as we say on Shavuot, the idea of covenant at Mount Sinai, like it's almost like you can wake up each morning and choose to either obey or love or whatever word you want your spouse, but there's a certain point that if you like get to a certain higher level of the relationship where you don't need to make that choice anymore. It's kind of part of who you are.
Right. If you think about the story of the Garden of Eden, there are blades, swords that block the way, right? Back to the tree of life. But the swords are consistently moving, so you can't get there, but you can sort of see through it. So there's a movement. It's not like now we're out and that's it. But we still tell the story of what it was like before. So that story is still alive for us. So there's a ratzov vashov it's taken from the book of Ezekiel, and the Kabbalists interpreted it as your hachayot ratzov vashov, the angels were running back and forth. It says hachiyut ratzov vashov, that a person's will or life force is in constant motion, right? So you get closer and you get feeling it's too close, and you have to back off because it's too much, right? And you have a lot of this in the stories of the Bible, right? The stories of Nadav va'Avihu, right? When they get devoured
Aaron
by the fire.
The sons of Aaron.
Right? They get devoured by the fire because they didn't pull back, right? So their consciousness, they were obliterated in terms of the religious experience, or the fear of the Jewish people at Sinai. When God appears at Sinai, they run to Moses, and they say, "You speak to us, because if God speaks to us, we'll die." Right? And Moshe tries to hold on to them. No, it's okay, but they still are thrown back. So the relationship is not like this stable, everything is fine, we worked it out, and now it's smooth sailing. People's consciousness are in constant flux.
Beautiful. And we're talking, I'm holding these two ideas that he's kind of talking about, reaching a level of divine consciousness where you feel almost compelled, and that's what affects your free will. And also your story about how he related to the Kutzker Rebbe, that he was a little bit too harsh.
Right.
Bring me into how he thinks about transgression. How does the Mei HaShiloach think about those not perfect moments where you're messing up?
Right. So he has sort of, it's a before-after typology, let's say. If something is forbidden, it's forbidden. The question is, if you transgress, the question is, how do you interpret what happened, right? And what do you do with it, right? So he feels that you can actually reinterpret the past, right? And that's how you redeem it. In a sense, there's Talmudic passages which, look, Hasidut in general, I always say this, people think Hasidut is like this totally new movement. It's really firmly based in Talmudic thought and in Midrashic thought. So the Talmudic statement that says that when a person does repentance, when they do tshuva, so their evil deeds become merits. How does that happen? Right? You could say you're forgiven, but how does it become a merit, right? So the idea is that you look back and you can actually, from where you're standing now, you can reinterpret the meaning of what happened and now appreciate that maybe it needed to happen. That's what it means. Like looking back, it needed to happen. It doesn't mean but looking forward, I don't know. So looking forward, in a sense, one way of looking at it is looking forward, I have free will. Looking backwards, I didn't have free will.
Beautiful.
It's sort of a complex view of reality. It's not you do or you don't. It has to do with your consciousness and how you look at things.
Right. I'm a big believer. At one point when we were discussing names for the show, we did not do anything radical. I wanted to call it Ishbitzer Rebbe, or the man in the field. Because the story that I connect with most in all of Judaism is the story of Joseph going to find his brothers. And
like that story.
his father sends him to find his brothers, who he knows hate him and would probably be not nice to him. And he can't find them, and instead of giving up, he runs into some man in a field, literally, and the man says they went that way. And that encounter with the man in the field shapes all of Jewish history, because he goes to them, they throw him in the pit, he goes to slavery, he becomes the big shot in Egypt.
And that's why the sages say that man was an angel.
Right, exactly, right. And so, the ways to think about those are, the way I bring that into my life is I think of all of us as angels in some ways, right? That there are times I notice in my life where the words blurred out of my mouth make absolutely no sense in that moment, and it almost feels like I'm acting on someone else is pulling the strings, if that makes sense. And so I often think of, we have these encounters in our life that shape the trajectory of our lives forever, and we're in some ways we all serve as malachim, which is angels in English, but also literally means messengers of God, that we're being sent to do God's bidding. And then, like you said, you're looking back afterwards and you realize, the mundane example of the Yankees losing or whatever it is, but that there are these moments that when we look back, did the Ishbitzer Rebbe, did he have free will in that moment or not? Or it's just like it was there, it sent that.
And we only realize that he's meaningful afterwards. Because
of course.
As it's happening, it was like he had breakfast, he met some guy on the way, maybe he said hello to somebody else, right?
Yeah.
But that was the meaningful.
Yeah.
That was a meaningful encounter.
I'll add to that. We had Chune Sugihara, who was here. His grandfather saved the thousands of visas for Jews during the Holocaust. And one of the wildest things that came out of that interview was that this all happened obviously in the 40s. And it wasn't until the late 60s. He had no contact with anyone he saved. He didn't know what happened to them. He had no story. And then someone who was like a big shot in the government in Israel had been saved by him and went and started looking for him. They called the Japanese government and they couldn't track him down. And so you talk about someone who was in Ishbitzer Rebbe. He literally, there's hundreds of thousands of people alive today because of him. And he had 20 years where he had been fired from the Japanese government because he was not loyal, and he had no sense of what his impact was on the world. And he was the Ishbitzer Rebbe, maybe to this day, has no idea what ended up happening with that guy he met in the field that day.
Right.
It's a crazy thing that we could play that role in
crazy.
that way. All right, I'll zoom out a little bit more. I'll ask a couple more questions here. Through the lens of what you shared earlier about the way you think about Judaism, and I was almost thinking of I heard Judah Michelle say once that when you hear the signal is out there, right? And then Judaism, you have to turn on your whatever. You show up in America, you have to switch your cellular data plan, that kind of thing to catch it, right? So, and we talked about how it's not the Jewish people are unique. You had the
Copernican revolution,
realizing the Jews are not the center of the world. So why do Jews need Judaism, and why does the world need the Jews?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think that no one can escape, or should actually want to escape, their civilization. Because there's so much to, let's say, embrace in the world. Meaning in terms of knowledge, in terms of beauty, and it's more than one person can take in. So what civilization is through literature, which is sort of horizontal, and through history, which is vertical, it becomes an accumulation of human experience. So my being part of my civilization is I absorb not only my own experience, which is very limited, right? I was born in Brooklyn, I studied in certain places, I made Aliyah, I live in Efrat, right? And, I've been to places, but obviously it's a very limited experience, right? But by being part of my civilization, I stood at Har Sinai, right? I wandered with Avraham. I was on the altar, staring up at the angels with the knife on my throat, right? I was in Egypt, right? So it's part of who I am, right? So I think those stories that the Jewish people as a civilization bring to the world are very valuable. So that's what the Jews bring to the world. The Jews bring empathy for slaves. That's what the Torah says, right? You know the soul of the sojourner because you were an alien. You were an alien in the land of Egypt, so you have to have empathy for them. You were a slave, so you know what it is to be a slave, right? That's why the first mitzvah, in a sense, the first set of laws after leaving Egypt has to do with how we treat slaves, right? That's Parshat Mishpatim, Ki Tikna Eved Ivri. If you have a Hebrew slave, that's the first laws that they put forth. Is okay, we were slaves, now we have laws, which means we're independent. We have the possibility to make laws and to receive laws and to be responsible, right? Because that's what it is to be free, to be responsible. And the first thing they do is to make laws governing slavery. So that's the nature. I think it's empathy, and it's empathy based on being created in the image of God.
Beautiful. And then I'll take it one step further. So we talked about the value of Judaism. Tell me why, we've discussed I'm a Musar guy.
And I'm a Chassidut guy.
And my 6 chavrutas from yeshiva are all Chassidut people. What is Chassidut, what is that providing that we're lacking? And then after that, I'll ask you what the Mei HaShiloach is providing that Chassidut is lacking.
I think what Chassidut adds is that it takes religion and makes it interior. In other words, we have mitzvot and we have narratives, right? And they happen out there. There's a narrative about what happened. The Jews were in Egypt, they were slaves, and it's sort of pseudo-history. I say pseudo-history because it's not historically documented, right? But we relate to it as something that happened in the world in a somewhat historical way, right? Okay? The question is, what's the meaning of that, right? So if I talk about the meaning of it, so that's like a Hasidic, you can talk about it as a Hasidic turn inward. The meaning of, say, the exodus from Egypt and being pursued by the Egyptians and coming to the splitting of the sea and encountering Amalek and receiving the Torah, it's really an internal journey, right? That we all have the demons that pursue us and we try to get away from them, and we have to then encounter them, and how are we ultimately freed from them, right? So they made the story, which is a story on the stage of history, and they made it on the stage of the human soul. And I think I would even take that further, right, to say that the story actually began on the stage of the human soul, and that's what generated the stories, right? So I'm trying to think of an example. Oh, so look in the book of Mishlei, right?
Proverbs,
says
yeah.
Proverbs, right? The author says, "Kotveim aluchot libecha," write them on the tablets of your heart, right? But that's what the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments on the tablets, really are. They started with the tablets on the heart, but that's why we talk about them as tablets, because there are tablets. We picture tablets of the heart, and so the image, the biblical image, is actually very Hasidic. It's not just a weak drasha, sort of a homily that's not based in the textual meaning, right? But it actually, I always say that Kissinger used to say that in foreign affairs, sometimes an argument has the additional virtue of being true. So sometimes I say, sometimes in hermeneutics, sometimes a Hasidic hermeneutic has the additional virtue of being pshat. Right?
That's great. Pshat
meaning like that's what it, right. So sometimes people think, oh, this is when people begin to study Chassidut, they say, oh, this is a nice pshat. It's like such an interesting way of reading it, but of course that's not what it means, right? But it's a different way of looking at the text, which, if we go into it, I think it's very much connected to the way Freud reads things, which is called, he has this thing called primary process, which is associative thinking. So you have two words which seem to have different meanings, but they sound alike, and they come together in a dream, for example, right? And that's what the Hasidic reading is very often. So the luchot and the luchot, kotvem al luchot libecha, really does start with what's written on your heart. And then it gets projected onto the tablets of Sinai. And there are midrashim that can be interpreted that way.
Sure.
Right.
First of all, that's so helpful to me. I remember the first time being in the Beit Midrash in rabbinical school, my friends encouraging me to study Chassidut, and me feeling like there are no rules to this game. Like, I don't understand. Like, I'm used to studying Talmud or Musar, where there's kind of like, here are the rules. This is what you can do. This is how far you can interpret something.
Right.
And like, did he hear that from someone? Like, how does he just make that thing?
Right.
And you kind of framing it as like, well, it's a different way to think about interpretation that has to do with associative. Like, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
And,
it's a different way of looking at it.
Makes it warmer. Okay, and then I'll go one step further. Then, so the Ishbitz, what does the Ishbitz add to the conversation that's different than everyone else?
Well, I think he emphasizes the existential side. Whereas what he's looking for, he has this line where he says, "Atid Hakadosh Baruch Hu legalot et oro Yisrael lelo levushim." In the future time, in the eschaton, right? But he's not really talking about the future time, right? God will reveal His light to the people without garments. And what he means by that, a garment is sort of the way we interpret things. We all have interpretations of reality. We don't see pure reality, right? It goes back to that, right? So suppose I'm a Marxist, right? So I interpret everything as class struggle and using economics as a way of dominating one class, dominating another. And I'll look at all of history, right? And I'll interpret it that way. If I'm a feminist, I'll look at it as a struggle, a power struggle between the genders, right? And I'll interpret history that way. If I'm a Zionist, right, I'll interpret Jewish history as the striving of the Jewish people to return to their ancient homeland, right? Now, all these things have truths to them, but of course, the disposition that I have will lead me to certain interpretations. I'll notice certain things, but I won't notice other things, right? So, so that's a lavush. So it's the glasses we wear when we interpret reality.
Those are the garments.
Those are the garments, right? So if I say that the God will reveal his light without garments, there'll be something which is, what are the levushim of how we perceive God? And he says this explicitly, Torah mitzvot, right? The law and the commandments. These are the ways we approach God, right? But in the future, God will reveal himself without that, right? Well, that means all the narratives and the Kabbalistic symbolism, that will be set aside. And so what are we left with? We're left with pure experience, right? And that's what he's striving for, right? He doesn't set them aside. He was very observant, right? But he understood there was something beyond that, that all the things which we put, like, which we seem to put ultimate meaning in, like the study of the Torah, in the narrow sense of the word, right? And Torah mitzvot, which are indispensable,
Of course.
right? But they're not the ultimate reality. And that's actually where, you know, the Litvaks, that's where they would really disagree. Like there was a real disagreement here, right? So
Sorry, because they would say?
they would say that the Torah is the ultimate reality. Whereas the Mei HaShiloach would say, and Chassidut in general would go along with this, but Mei HaShiloach said it in a very clear way, he would say it's not the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is the experience that you have as a human being encountering God, because that's both human and divine, because we're created, it always comes back to the image of God.
Beautiful, and to try to bring this into practical terms.
Right. Okay. So now I think I can deep breath. So I don't even remember what your question was.
It was what the Mei HaShiloach added, and you started by saying that he focused on the existential question, and
right. So
then you talked about the clothing.
Right. So what is it? So what becomes significant front and center is human experience. That's something, in a very powerful way, which is. Which syncs with other Hasidic masters, but it's very pronounced in his thought.
So just give me one more. So when you say human experience and, you know, revealing God beyond the garments, what is? Can you give me can someone do that today, or that's something that we don't even know what that looks like? Is that like a sunset?
That's That's a very serious question, because things are complicated, and the experience that you have always has to be checked, right? He has like sort of a corrective to this, that things don't become purely subjective, which he calls beirur, which is clarification. Like you always have to check what your motivations are. Do you have some sort of vested interest in some sort of interpretation? Are you being honest with yourself? Like it's very, very demanding. Here you can hear a little bit of Kutsk, right? It's very, very demanding. Right? And sometimes you can't really trust yourself, even if you feel you've done the introspection, and you have to collaborate with other people. And you have to ask somebody that you respect, like, am I okay here? Do you think this is okay? And sometimes it's one other person, and sometimes you need a hetamei rabbanim, sometimes you need 100 people, sometimes things take a generation to work out. So it's complicated, right?
Okay.
But clearly that's how tradition develops, right? And depending on the severity of the question, you need a different type of clarification. So let's take an example. Talk about Zionism, right? I believe that Zionism, in other words, the idea that the Jewish people should have sovereignty and a modern nation state, okay, a certain flavor of Zionism, obviously, right? Which is what happened to Zionism, right? That idea is certainly a departure from the traditional beliefs of Jewish civilization until then. The traditional beliefs were Satmar. You wait for Mashiach, right? So what happened, right? So a major shift in the consciousness of the Jewish people, which is a product of, modern European history and national. It has more to do with Bismarck and Napoleon than it has to do with the with the Nevi'im, with the prophets, right? It's what happened in Europe and the emergence of nation states and nationalism and the Jews' experience of anti-Semitism and hey, we could do this too, right? So that's a major shift. So in that sense, you could look at the shift in consciousness as a revelation. And that, I believe, is the core of the real significance of Yom HaAtzmaut. Of course, we just had Yom HaAtzmaut, right?
Sure.
But of course, the military victories and the economic miracle and all of that, that's part of Yom HaAtzmaut. But all those things could only be possible as, again, the significant stage is human consciousness. There was a shift in the consciousness of the Jewish people, which I believe, a matter of faith, God orchestrated, which he set in motion hundreds of years ago in terms of the emergence of modernity and national identities and the revolutions in Europe, and that brought this to Jewish consciousness.
Wow. All right, so I'm just going to...
So it's much bigger. This is an example of the Copernican revolution.
Beautiful. So I want to square that with what you said about the removing of the garments then. So in that metaphor, the garments are the idea that we wait for Mashiach and the shifting of consciousness that we are now...
Okay. I mean, I didn't think of it that way.
Yeah, so help me through there.
That the removal of garments calls attention to human consciousness, because that's what you have when you strip everything else away.
So it was a moment where we had to put aside the traditional Jewish assumption now held by the Satmar community that we need to wait for Mashiach. We had a moment of pushing those garments aside and actually connecting to God in a way that it sounds like goes both ways. You mentioned that God was planting the seeds in history, and we as a conscious community developed a consciousness that allowed us to see, no, we need to do this thing. We need to create this modern state so we can have a sovereign home.
Right.
And there's a moment.
But there's no conscious decision in which that happens, right? It's not like somebody got up and said, okay, now we're not going to be Satmar. In other words, there was just an awareness that grew that this is what needs to be done among most people, right? And that's
right. And there were writers who kind of
Right,
Herzel, like that kind of idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Beautiful. All right. Share with me. We're gonna at some point we're out of time here. I asked you, and I didn't get to it yet, a little bit like a favorite teaching of the Mei HaShiloach that you want to share.
So this is my favorite teaching, and it's the first teaching that sort of hooked me, right? In the Ten Commandments, of course, the first word is Anochi Hashem Elokecha, right? I am the Lord your God. Now, the word Anochi is sort of an archaic form. It should be Ani. Ani is I. Anochi is like a royal we, right? So the Mei HaShiloach talks about what is the significance of Anochi as opposed to Ani. And he says, if it would have said Ani, Hashem Elokecha, that would have denoted that God revealed everything at Sinai, right? And the truth is, that's what most people are taught. And everything from there was like downhill, right? We always try to go back to Sinai, right? That's the whole idea of Yeridat HaDorot. The generations get weaker and weaker because we get further away from that moment, right, of complete revelation, and the rest is forgetfulness, right? So he takes the opposite view. He says that it would have meant that the revelation was complete, and the problem with that is you'd have nowhere to go with it, and you couldn't develop it. So Anochi, the kaf, the significance of the kaf,
that's the
letter kaf,
added,
right, is, in Hebrew there's this idea called the kaf hadimayon, the kaf of comparison. Right? We have it in halachic thinking, kaf hadimayon, hihur kidibur, shomea ka'oneh, right? Did we compare different concepts?
Right, ke, like there means like.
Like, right?
X, ke, y, X is like y, yeah.
Hearing is like responding, right? So is like. So of course, the is like is always amorphous, because in what sense is it like, right? So he says that the kaf in Anochi is a kaf hadimayon. So he's saying it's as if the Ten Commandments opens up with what you see here is sort of like who I am, right? And the significance of that is Ani ke Hashem Elokecha. There isn't a clear revelation, and the significance of that is that we thus continue to learn it and refine it infinitely. The kaf hadimayon is sort of opens up like this infinite horizon, right? And that's really important to introduce uncertainty into religious experience, because in a world which cleaves to certainty and people are like dug into their beliefs and I'm right and you're wrong and there's no self-reflection, right? Especially in religious things, but unfortunately not only on religious issues which we suffer today. So the Mei HaShiloach's teaching allows us a certain type of, brings forth a certain type of humility, where yes, I can believe what I believe, I understand what I understand, but I have to understand that my picture is incomplete. And then he goes on to say that if I would deny the kaf hadimayon, then I would be, then he proceeds into the next, into the 10 Commandments, then I would transgress the prohibition of not making an idol. Because an idol is basically an existence without the kaf hadimayon. Because an idol is something that you can hold, you can see it on both sides. It is what it is. There's no room for imagination, right? And the kaf hadimayon actually in Hebrew, dimayon both means similarity, but it also means imagination. Sure. Because you need imagination to draw the similarities, because the imagination is not there, right? The similarity is not there. You just have two pieces of data, and you're saying, oh, they're similar. That takes imagination, right? So that's the teaching that I love the most, among many teachings that I love the most.
Thank you so much. Truly a treat. I've learned so much. I feel like I got like a mini lesson in the Mei HaShiloach here, and I hope people are excited to learn more. And you can look up Har'el online for sure, and Rabbi Hefter, and also you can learn more about Mei HaShiloach if you Google him as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.